Hello, I am Rahul Gopinath and I present a technique for the extraction of input grammars from dynamic control flow. Why do we need a grammar in the first place? Consider traditional fuzzing. In traditional fuzzing, we generate random data which is then fed into the program, and it can quickly expose vulnerabilities that the program may have, leading to a crash. Unfortunately, when the program accepts structured inputs, the effectiveness of this technique is drastically reduced, as the program rarely returns anything other than a syntax error for random inputs. The problem is that almost all of the random inputs are caught at the parser level and hence do not reach the semantic core of the program, leaving the most important parts of the code unexplored. That is, we have to use techniques that can generate inputs without syntax error. The solution is to use an input grammar to generate inputs to the program. So here is the arithmetic expression grammar that describes the arithmetic expression language. Using such a grammar, one can generate inputs that conform to the grammar, which when fed into the program successfully passes the parser and hence reaches the core. Given that grammar fuzzing is such a useful technique, the question then is, where do we get the grammar from? Unfortunately, it is really hard to obtain trustworthy grammar specifications. One may think that the programmers write the design documentation first and we can recover the formal grammar specification from the design documentation. Unfortunately, it seems that not many start with the design first. Having a formal specification is the exception rather than the norm in our profession. Even when a design documentation is available, it is often not in sync with the actual code. Very few projects keep their specifications updated as they add features. Further, the spec may not be fully implemented or the parser may contain bugs. Worst of all, even when a parser is implemented against a well-accepted standard, such parsers tend to accept far more than what the standard specifies, trying to be tolerant of inaccuracies in the input. Unfortunately, it is precisely these parts of the input language that can cause vulnerabilities in the program. Many such extensions unfortunately become de facto standards with no formal specification. In essence, the input language is exactly what the parser implements, no more, no less. The JSON format is a case in point. The original specification was small enough to be printed on a business card. Unfortunately, almost no parser implements a spec correctly. So where do we get a grammar from? Notice that handwritten parsers already encode the grammar, albeit in an obfuscated fashion. Given a textbook-style parser, one can almost directly recover the context-free grammar from the parser definition. The input parser for a given program accurately describes its input language. So given that the grammar is encoded in the parser, it should be possible to recover this grammar. So how do we extract this grammar? Remember that not all programs are written in this textbook style. So we present a technique that can extract such grammars from given programs. Our technique first extracts parse trees from given sample inputs that cover all features of the program. Then it combines these parse trees into a general grammar. So we look at how to decompose a string into parse trees first. The key idea here is that dynamic method called tree mirrors the parse tree. For example, when 3 times 4 is parsed, the call graph produced accurately reflects the parse tree of 3 times 4. One wrinkle here is where to attach each character. There could be multiple functions that processes a single character from the input. One of our crucial observations was that we do not need to track which functions accesses a character beyond the first level input parser. That is, we stop tracking as soon as the parsing stage of the input string is over. And we do that by stopping the tracking as soon as the string is copied or converted into any other data structure. This means that we discard any details of continued processing. However, we found that the context-free processing rarely continues beyond processing of the input buffer. The great thing about our approach is that it's really lightweight. It is easy to incorporate this into a new language. In Python, we did this by simply wrapping the input string on a proxy object and checking which characters were accessed from that string. Now we need to identify which characters are processed by which functions. So our next idea is that a character in the input is consumed by the last method that accessed it. That is, if parseTerm accesses the star character last, then parseTerm consumes the star character. That is, the star character then becomes one of the terminal symbols of the definition of non-terminal that corresponds to the parseTerm. Our idea of stopping processing as soon as the parsing stage is over makes this approach trivial to implement. Now that we have seen how the string is decomposed, we can look at how the components of the grammar are constructed. We first look at non-terminal symbols. So typically, one can use the method names or fragments of them in the corresponding grammar that is actually human readable. So these form the non-terminal symbols. Next, if a part of the string was parsed by a particular method and the same method parses another part of the same string or another string, we can replace one part by the other and still obtain a syntactically valid string. Here, we replace the initial parse expression call with a later parse expression call to obtain a new string. The new string thus produced, that is 8, is still semantically valid. When we describe a context-free grammar, a given non-terminal symbol is usually described with multiple alternative rule expansions. So we will next see how we can extract these from the methods. The key idea here is that each dynamic control flow node is treated as a pseudo method. That is, each branch of an if condition becomes a pseudo method. The call hierarchy from such pseudo methods directly contribute to the grammar structure. So for example, the match conditional becomes a pseudo method called if_1. The if1 now has 3 expansions, each of which are constructed from the calls made from within the corresponding matching branch. Next is loops. To illustrate loops, we use a slightly more complex example that parses the same arithmetic expression language. The key idea here is that loops are not necessarily freestanding. In many cases, loop iterations carry state, and we cannot replace one loop iteration with another. Instead, there are often loop sequences that we should consider together. Here, for example, the loop sequence would be an iteration that matches a number, followed by an iteration that matches an operator, which again is followed by an iteration that matches a number. We find which loop iterations are compatible with each other using active learning. That is, we first identify all iterations in a particular function. Next, we replace that iteration with a randomly chosen iteration. If the new input produced is valid, then the iterations are compatible. If on the other hand, the new input produced is valid, then the iterations are compatible. Here is an intuitive view of what happens. The isOp variable holds state and hence divides the iterations into two kinds. The first where isOp is false and the second where isOp is true. The first kind of iterations are interleaved with the second and they correspond to either numbers or nested expressions. The second kind of iterations identify operators, and these only occur between the first kind. That is, we always need an odd number of loop iterations, and the even numbered iterations are always operators. For better accuracy, we also verify our assumption that parsing methods are compatible. If we find any that are not compatible, we rename the incompatible method invocation with a unique suffix. These get us into generalized parse trees from which context-free grammar can be directly made. So next, we discuss how the parse trees can be combined to form the grammar. The idea is to start at the root and traverse each parse tree. Each node is inspected and the name of the node becomes the name of the nonterminal. Names of child nodes become the definition of the nonterminal. At the end, the definitions are deduplicated to retrieve the context-free grammar. At this point, the grammar is almost ready. All that is left is to handle the lexical tokens. The main problem is that from our grammar mining, we may simply obtain a list of tokens and we need to find a way to generalize them. As you can see here, we have a list of numbers or characters that are listed without any further structure. The problem is that many parsers have a lexer face in front, and the lexers typically allow regular expressions to recognize tokens. These regular expressions are compiled into an automata, and matching is usually based on table lookups. Our technique for recovering the input structure is not suitable for recovering the tokens, as there are no procedures involved in the internals of a regular expression match. Hence, we cannot really recover the structure of the tokens. What we do in these cases is to inspect each character at a time and attempt to widen them. For example, if the character is a digit, we try to replace that character by another digit. If it successfully produces another valid input, we know that we can replace that character by any digit. We next widen it to alphanumeric characters and then to printable characters, etc. Once we have widened each character, we can then combine them together and identify the generality of repetition if any. That is, we check if the sequence can be replaced by empty or one or more of the same kind, and if it can be, then we can generalize the repetition accordingly. Continuing this way gets us to our final grammar. So here is the final recovered grammar from the arithmetic expression parser that we saw earlier. And another example is the JSON parser recovered from micro-JSON. Now we come to the evaluation. For evaluation, we chose programs based on different dimensions. So these were our subjects: calc, math expression, CGA decode, URL parse, micro-JSON, parse eclipse, JSON parser, TinyC, and NJS. So we chose two different programming languages, C and Python. For Python, we implemented our instrumentation by simply writing a proxy object for the input stream. For C, we inserted the instrumentation using LLVM. Next, we also chose different styles of writing a parser. With calc.py written in a textbook procedure style, mathexpression.py written in object-oriented style, cj.decode is essentially an automata, URL parser is written in an ad hoc style, micro.json is again an optimized parser, parsec lisp is a parser combinator, JSON parser is an optimized parser, and TinyC and MJS contains Lexical state in front. For each subjects, we used a small set of samples that explored all input features of the language, and we baselined our approach using autogram, which is a state-of-the-art in mining input grammars. Given these sample inputs, our approach was able to recover much better grammars than autogram for all subjects. Comparing the recall, the grammar generated by our tool Mimid produces high-quality inputs that will be accepted by the program with very high probability. Comparing the precision, the grammar produced by Mimid can recognize the generated input from the original input specification with very high probability too. That is, Mimid has better precision and better recall than state-of-the-art in grammar mining. Mimid is lightweight and can be applied on a variety of parsers, and the grammars produced by Mimid are well readable. Finally, our implementation is available as a standalone Jupyter notebook as well as a Vagrant VersaVox. So in summary, we showed why grammar mining was necessary, and we showed how the parse trees can be recovered from dynamic control flow. We also showed how to generalize the parse trees, how to generate the grammar from the parse trees, and we showed that Mimid has both high precision as well as high recall. Thank you for listening to my talk. I'll be available for any questions.